Well, it's that time of year again. Everybody's starting to think about the presidential election, and I'm just still sitting here on my lonesome thinking about Plato's Republic. Okay, welcome back to Young Heretics, and welcome also, I think, to Life Inside My Head. I'm recording this on a Monday, which means it's the date of the Iowa Republican primary election. Everybody's talking about, is Donald Trump going to win as handily as it seems he's going to? Is somebody else going to squeak out a victory? Ron DeSantis, Nikki Haley, who's going to pull ahead? And it's very snowy. It's apparently the coldest, I think, Iowa primary on record. Here in Nashville, we are having our annual snow day. We're snowed in with this big blizzard. It's as big as it's ever been since I moved here, which I'm sort of enjoying, watching the snow fall outside my window. It's probably miserable if you have to fight your way to a polling station. And I'm just trying to think about a way to explain to you guys why I does not care. I does not care about these primaries. I wish I could care. I want to care. I don't want to come across as saying that politics don't matter, that this election isn't important. That's not what I believe at all. You know, I do care about politics, watch politics, work at a think tank where politics is front and center a lot of the time. And I've argued before that whatever high, beautiful principles you may espouse, you do at some point have to make certain decisions, perform certain actions. So it's not a matter of indifference who you vote for. Elections haven't lost their meaning or significance even at this late stage. All of that remains true. And yet, these primaries are going on. And for one thing, it does seem increasingly likely that the outcome is a foregone conclusion. It just seems more and more to be the case that probably Donald Trump is going to win this race for nominee. Could be wrong about that. Predictions are always a fool's game, and I'm not a person that has a lot of confidence in his own predictions. That might not be true, but there's the level on which the primaries just don't seem to be poised to be really consequential in that sense. Like, are we really curious what's going to happen, or do we just feel like it's a foregone conclusion? But it's actually something more than that, and I think there might be something important buried under my sense that this is not a hugely consequential primary election. Because at this point, you know, I'm 33, so this show is called Young Heretics, but I've always stressed it's young in spirit, so hopefully we'll be here when I'm 80, still feeling young and youthful and loving with every ounce of as much passion the Western canon and all of that. But I'm 33, and even though that's not that old, I already sort of feel when it comes to politics like a kind of grizzled veteran, or one of those wizened old sorcerers that you meet at the outset of a quest in video games, that when everybody embarks on these big, epochal, world-changing election moments, I always feel like I'm sitting there in the corner with my hood at the inn and maybe a pint next to me on my table, and I'm saying things like, "Ah, yes, I have seen many an election come and go, for I have known cities that were great in my youth that are now small. And lo, yea, I have seen this third time the rising and the falling of Donald Trump like the coming of the moon." That's sort of how I'm starting to feel, because basically for the entirety of my adult life, the whole of my professional career, the temperature, the volume of political disputes has been dialed up to 11 and higher. And every time something happens, it has to get higher. And so we're just constantly ramping up, notching up our rhetoric until every single election is the election to end all elections. And again, it's quite possible, in fact, in some sense, it's inevitable that at some point there will be that election. There will be some big consequential moment. But on the other hand, it becomes very difficult after a while, after you've seen a few of these so-called make or break, be all or end all elections, to really believe that this particular strife and struggle, this particular fight that we're having, is going to be the thing that at last delivers a decisive verdict. It's almost unsustainable to live at this fever pitch where you're always saying, well, if you don't vote in District 13 for this particular Republican candidate for Congress, you're a traitor to the Republic and to the cause. And you get this now in like text messages every day. Somebody says, Spencer, I'm texting you particularly, all in capital letters, because Donald Trump will be personally shattered and furious if you do not stand behind whatever this guy's name is that's running for whatever this office is. And they're always trying to invent reasons why this really is the battle royale that separates the wheat from the chaff. This is where we learn who the true patriots are and who are the traitors to the Republic. Or if you're on the other side, if you're, on the left, and I do have some listeners I know that don't disagree with me, or that don't agree with me, rather, politically. If you're on that side, then this is the election that is going to show that the Republicans are once and for all insurrectionists, domestic extremists, terrorists. And don't misunderstand me to be saying that these elections don't matter, that they're not important. It's just that there isn't actually, I don't think, going to be the grand cataclysm that delivers what we all secretly kind of want, which is a final answer to where history is going or how this republic is going to fare in the future. I think we're in for a longer haul than that. And so forgive me if I'm not looking down the barrel of 2024 and thinking, oh yeah, relitigating the fight between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, that's really going to resolve our issues. That's really what's going to drive home the point that needs to be driven home, whatever that point is. At this point, having seen a few of these election cycles that were supposed to be the grand be-all and end-all, it feels a little bit more like they're actually ripples or bubbles on the surface of a much deeper churning series of currents, that actually something much more profound is going on, not just in America, although centrally in America, but also in the history and the development of the West, and maybe even of humanity and our spiritual development, that doesn't actually get resolved by a presidential election. And I know that can be kind of unsettling or frightening for people that want to pin all their hopes on some candidate or other. And look, I'm never going to make a secret with you guys of my political affiliations. I never have, I never will. I'm very happy to continue being as forthright as I know how to be with you about what I believe and what I think on the political landscape, as well as in these deeper issues to do with our salvation and our spiritual reality. But look, at a political level, I think of myself as an Americanist. I love this country. I care about its constitution. I think Joe Biden and his administration have been a disaster for both, and in some cases have really shown open contempt for our regime and our form of government. I think the Democrat Party is being subsumed under a large global and ultimately anti-American, maybe even anti-human movement, uprising that takes science or scientism as the be-all and end-all and wants to reduce everybody to numbers and all of that stuff. I think that's true. I also think Donald Trump is kind of a lout and has poorly handled the years after his loss to Biden. In some cases, I think that he also has shown disrespect for our Constitution and for our way of government. I would rather somebody else be the nominee, but all that having been said, I think he represents a marginally less evil party, or at least that the Republican Party is still clinging to some sort of outward vestige of the thing that I believe in and care about and am trying to carry forward, which is this great Western tradition as inherited by the American regime. And so in the end, I am going to vote for a Republican banana if that's who they elect. And I've said that from the beginning. I'm going to continue saying that. And if any of that makes you feel like I'm a traitor to the cause or a betrayer of the Republic or of conservatism or whatever, and you want to throw up your hands and storm out or metaphorically throw this podcast across the table. Okay, that's fine. Go ahead. I mean, we're going to have a whole year of this, so it's better to get it all out in the open now. And if you want also likewise to enlist me as your political cheerleader and pound the table when I say these things, then that's great too, I guess. Everybody is more than welcome. And I am going to continue being honest. And so if I say something that you disagree with, then that's also fine. We're grown-ups and we can talk about it. But in the last analysis, after all of that is said and done, I am here to talk to you about stuff that matters. That's what I say every week I'm going to do. Truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters. And I'm going to say again that these political disputes we're having, cataclysmic as they seem and as they are often represented to us as being kind of your last chance at saving democracy or saving the West, I think that these things we think of as immediate and urgent and important, these news cycle dominating matters, are actually the last steps in a very, very long chain of more important issues and concerns and transitions and transformations, some of which have been going on for a lot longer than any of us have been alive and have to do with the exhaustion of the Enlightenment idea and the failure of the scientific revolution to serve as a totalizing script for human life and a governing explanation of all things, who we are, what we are, where we're going. And that is, to me, not only more interesting, but actually of more urgent concern, even though it is not the sort of thing that you will read in an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. It's not the kind of thing that is going to be represented to you is, your stance on, let's say, Galileo or your belief about Kant is going to make or break you as a citizen and will define your legacy and how history regards you, whether you were complicit in the great evil of our times or whether you were a patriot and stood up and all of that. Most people are not going to demand your opinion about Plato's Republic as part of that kind of urgent news cycle level concern. And yet, these questions that people like Plato and Kant and the folks we tend to talk most about on this show, these questions that they were wrestling with are actually the questions driving our most profound shifts. And the way that we answer and approach those questions is going to be more important in the long run to saving the soul, not just of each of us individually, but the West more generally and our civilization, such as it is, such as it remains, in tatters though it may be. And so this is why I think I am starting to feel a kind of jaundiced disconnect from the level of urgency and intensity with which we talk about politics and the actual things that I think matter, that I care most deeply about. We tend to ignore or consider as sort of vague abstractions these questions of reality, real life, and the spiritual realm. But for me, that's what's most real. The most real thing is the realm of the spirit. And so it's all kind of giving shadows on the cave. It's all giving this impression that we're looking at a shadow play in front of us and scrolling through this cascade of things that represent themselves as hyper important. And it's actually distracting us from the core issues that are at stake about truth, beauty, goodness, and the stuff that matters. And Aristotle, in his prior and posterior analytics, has this wonderful point that we begin in human experience, human knowledge and reasoning. We begin with things that are most immediately accessible to our senses. We can see colors and we can see objects in front of us and material individual things. And so those strike us at first as being of primary importance. But actually, it's as we work our way from those things to first principles and to abstractions that we arrive at the really important and indeed purest objects of knowledge, things like goodness and truth. And even though Aristotle believes that these ideas or these abstractions are always embodied in the here and now, he also thinks that the things we first see that are most immediate and easiest for us to access through our senses are, in some sense, the last things that emanate out from these deeper trends and realities in the world. And if you want to use a more modern metaphor, you can think about the stuff that seems most attractive at the grocery store, the most splashy packaging, the most obvious and delicious foods are usually not going to be the things that will satisfy you most deeply. And you actually have to do a little bit more digging and thinking about, well, what are these packages offering me? What are the ingredients? What sorts of nutrients am I being invited to consume here? Until you get to realizing that actually what you need is meat and bread, right? And these kind of core kinds of foods. And that's when you can really build a good and healthy menu. And so this is why the whole kind of distinction between how we immediately experience the world and what's really going on underneath is bringing me back again to what we were talking about last week with the disunity, the disparity between the outward and the inward life. Last week I talked a lot about Claudine Gay and the Harvard presidency and how so many of our major institutions have become not simply corrupt and not simply evil or whatever else, but also dishonest in this fundamental way, that the form or the face or the mask that they present and their major kind of officers present to the world is a lie, is a distraction from the underlying reality of what's going on within. And that disconnect is really the fundamental problem that plagues us and has always plagued us as what I've called symbolical beings. Because I really think that actually at the core of our nature is to be embodied souls. That is, these sensory experiences that we have that I was just talking about that seem so immediate to us, the things that we see and touch and smell and can hear, and the politics we read about that are most directly apparent to us in the moment, those are the things that make up the matter of what we are, the stuff of what we are. Our bodily life is all sensory. But at the same time, we have a deep innate sense that the things which are most true and matter most to us and are most core about our existence actually can't be encapsulated in any sort of sensory way at all. If I say the word love to you, I've said, in some sense, the simplest and most urgent and core part of your life, or at least one of the most urgent and core parts of your life, and yet I haven't said anything that can be drawn in a picture or written in a song or a poem. I haven't said anything that I could touch or smell or taste or access through the senses. I can use all of those media to convey images or moments or experiences of love to you, but I can't get love embodied in a sensory way. And that's actually true of many things that we've talked about frequently on the show. We've talked about memory, desire, aspirations, virtue, all of these things which can be embodied in particular moments and actions, but in their core, in their essence, have to be known through the senses, not in the senses. There is a fleshly life that we live, which we know is a conduit for us to something that is beyond the flesh and beyond the senses and the physical world. And you can call this the distinction between being and becoming, as Plato's Socrates sometimes does. You can call it the distinction between spirit and flesh, between body and soul. Whatever you want to call it, we all know that it's there. And if you take the spiritual part away, all the rest of everything fails to make any sense. Everything we do and want stops making sense. And it's very tempting to take the spiritual part away because that's the part that we can't pin down, that we can't encounter through the senses, which are so immediate to us and that feel so much more distant and less real than how am I going to put food on the table? Whom am I going to elect or vote for President of the United States? What do my kids want from me right now? What are they yelling at me about today? Those things matter and are important. But if we take these material concerns to be the only things that really exist, which is one of the things that the scientific revolution, or at least the corruption that ensued after the scientific revolution, has taught us to do, to take this material world as most real or the only real thing. And we just wave away all the rest of it as kind of an illusion or a biological accident or an evolutionary afterthought. Then suddenly you're confronted with the question, why do anything at all? And the minute you try to answer that, you suddenly find yourself groping for that spiritual realm that you've just closed off to yourself. You find yourself saying things like, well, I want my kids to get a good education because I want them to thrive and succeed and be happy. And why do you want that? Well, because you love them. And so suddenly you've invoked a whole realm, a whole host of concepts and entities and beliefs and ideas that don't have any material embodiment and yet inform everything that you do in the physical world. And unless we allow that spiritual dimension of reality to exist, we can't make sense of ourselves. But allowing that spiritual dimension in is very painful and requires all sorts of difficult sacrifices from us. Because the minute we do that, the minute we have to see and feel the distance between our embodied fleshly selves and these ideals that can occupy eternity, that can appear in all of these different times and places, something like love that we can recognize both in the cup of coffee that our spouse puts on the table for us and in the relationship between Abraham and Sarah in the Bible, hundreds and hundreds of years, thousands and thousands of years ago. Suddenly, if we believe that such a thing as love is real and is as real or more real than the things we can smell and touch and see, then we have to acknowledge the existence of eternal and perfect realities, even if they're never perfectly embodied here. To make use of this concept of the spiritual, we have to make use of the ideal and the perfect and the good and the eternal. And when we do that, suddenly we are aware of how far short we always fall, because we, at least in our bodily lives, do not endure forever. We can't be in multiple places at once, and we don't live up to the things that we feel we are aspiring toward. And so that space of separation between the things that are fleshly, that are here and now, on the one hand, and the things that are eternal and spiritual on the other, the separation or the alienation between those two things is perhaps the deepest pain, the deepest grief that we know. And it is communicated to us in the Christian and in the Jewish traditions as an exile from Eden, as the separation from paradise, as the angel with the flaming sword who prevents us from returning to our home, where perhaps these two things can be united and aligned in some way. And we only now can catch glimpses of it in our best moments, when we feel most aligned and at peace and in joy, in love. Perhaps the first, you can think of some moments maybe in your life when this happened. Maybe the first time you saw your child being born, or when you fell in love, or even maybe something you created, some kind of work of art or literature, or something you built that afforded you this glimpse, like a little window opening up, a little space in the way, as it says in Stephen Sondheim's song Finishing the Hat, which is about the artistic process. He says, leaves a little space in the way like a window, but to see, it's the only way to see. And this is what we're talking about. We're talking about the connection that sometimes opens up, where you see that it is possible, or it should be possible at least, for the spirit and the flesh to be united, to have a kind of union. But always and everywhere there is a gap or a distance or a slippage that comes in, and that, like the gap and the slippage that makes it impossible for us to write perfect calendars, which I was talking about at the beginning of this year. These sort of disconnects between the perfect realm of the heavens and the spheres and the stars and this messy sublunary earthly realm. And it struck me as I was thinking about this, because of course, naturally, why wouldn't you think about this when it's Iowa caucus day? But as I made my way from the Iowa caucuses to this eternal and central disconnection between our fleshly and our spiritual existence, that actually this is one way of understanding what Plato's Socrates is on about when he exiles the poets from the Republic. And we have visited this to some extent on this show. I did a series of episodes about Plato's Republic, and I was talking about the various points at which Socrates starts to worry that Homer and the other great poets of the Greek tradition might not be able to come along to the Callipolis, to the ideal state. And in Book 10 of the Republic, he really hammers the point home in a metaphysical sense. Previously, he's done this. He said, well, maybe the poets encourage our boys to indulge their emotions, and they have to act on stage in tragedies, and that makes them aspire to less than admirable ideals, like they have to weep and moan and cry, and this is all isn't this sort of womanly and erratic? And he deals with that to an extent, which we will come back to. But in Book 10 of the Republic, when he's talking about the sort of metaphysical underpinnings of this whole regime, he does take the poets again to task in a serious and in some ways fundamental or principle level, first principle level way. And he does it precisely because art, that is the depiction of things that we experience in the world, is already at one degree of remove from what we are, which in turn, our life, even before we get to art, our life is already at one degree of remove from what for Plato is the ideal realm, the spiritual realm. So let me read to you just one of these passages so that I can remind you about how this works, and maybe this will help us to kind of get our way into what I think is this space that opens up between spirit and flesh, that is the space where we start to ask questions about morality in art, which turn out to really just be questions about the nature of humanity in its deepest sense. So here we go. Now I'm reading, as always, from the Alan Bloom translation of the Republic. If I'm not translating it for you myself, I am going to always be reading it from Alan Bloom's translation, which is very good, and you can get it on Amazon, and it's got some excellent notes, good essays in here as well. And I'm on Book 10, as I mentioned, and this is going to be Stephanus, page 596b. And if you've not heard me explain this before, if you're relatively new to the show, when you're reading Plato and when you're reading Aristotle, you get Stephanus pages for Plato and Becker pages for Aristotle, and these refer to early editions with systematic numbering, which we now still use. So you'll get a regular page in your book, but then you'll also get a universal reference point that anybody in any edition, any translation can use. So we're here at 596b, and we've got Socrates talking with Glaucon, one of the two brothers of Plato that become kind of central interlocutors in this dialogue. And here's what we have to say about the artists. Let's now set down any one of the manys that you please. So you're talking about individual items that exist in the world. For example, if you wish, there are surely many couches and tables. So Socrates introduces this idea. There's all these couches and tables around us, many different versions of them. Of course, says Glaucon. But as for ideas for these furnishings, there are presumably two, one of couch and one of table. And this is a really sort of controversial moment for Plato scholars, because previously we've had forms of things like justice and love and these abstractions that we're able to contemplate to some extent. But now we have like the form of the table, which is sort of a remarkable thing, but we see why we need it, because otherwise how could we say that this is a table and that is a table and there are all these different kinds of things that are called tables unless we had some idea about what it is to be a table, the tableness of the table. Aren't we also accustomed to say that it is in looking to the idea of each implement that one craftsman makes the couches and another the chairs we use, and similarly for other things? For presumably none of the craftsmen fabricates the idea itself. How could he? In no way. Well now, see what you call this craftsman here. Which one? He who makes everything that each one of the manual artisans makes separately. That's a clever and wonderful man that you speak of. Not yet. In an instant, you'll say that even more. For this same manual artisan is not only able to make all the implements, but also makes everything that grows naturally from the earth, and he produces all animals, the others, and himself too. And in addition to that, produces earth and heaven and gods and everything in heaven and everything in Hades under the earth. That's quite a wonderful sophist you speak of, he said. Are you distrustful, I said, and tell me, in your opinion, could there be altogether no such craftsman? Or in a certain way, could a maker of all these things come into being and in a certain way not? Or aren't you aware that you yourself could in a certain way make all these things? You could fabricate them quickly in many ways, and most quickly, of course, if you are willing to take a mirror and carry it around everywhere. Quickly you will make the sun and the things in the heavens, quickly the earth, and quickly yourself, and the other animals and implements and plants and everything else that was just now mentioned. So Socrates is suggesting that artists are like mirrors, that they hold up, as Shakespeare would later say, a mirror to nature, and they catch thereby something like the world. You pick up this mirror. This mirror is, let's say, your poem about the fall of Troy. And in this mirror, there are horses and men and battles and wars and fights, but it's simply an image. It's only a picture of them, and all you're getting is one sensory impression. You're getting this one experience of one human mind that is able to lay this out before you as a sensory experience. But one of the things we've just said is, aren't sensory experiences just kind of the very most extreme outward edge of reality? And they're only the surface. They're the most superficial thing you can get to. And when you dig down beneath those appearances, you get a core that is ideal or spiritual or some reality. And what Plato is saying is that's happening twice now with art. We start with God, or the gods, who are the supreme artists. They have created these things out of nothing, these ideas of things like at least justice and maybe even earth or the table or air, fire, and water. They have these pure and perfect ideas of what it would mean in essence to be those things. And then they have embodied those things in flesh. They have clothed them in flesh, or God himself has clothed these things in flesh by creation. This is kind of last week when I was reading to you from Giorgio Vasari, and God was the supreme artist. There he had this idea in his divine mind of the world and ultimately of man. And then by clothing that idea in flesh, he was able to make many different men, because the idea of man doesn't depend on any one lump of flesh or hunk of dirt. It is perfect and abstract and forever and eternal, and it lives in God's mind. But any individual man is going to be some particular kind of emanation, like looking at that idea from one angle, you're going to get Bob or Adam or Joe, right? That's how, in this idea of things, that's how creation works, that you have this idea and then it gets embodied in individuals, particular individuals. And similarly, you might say there's such a thing as being a couch, and anybody that makes a couch clothes that idea in physical experience, in sensory matter, and then gives you one angle, one snapshot of what couches are like. But now the couch too is able to be experienced in the sensory realm. This individual couch can be experienced. And when you look at a couch, you're not looking directly at the idea of couchness. Or when you look at Bob, you're not looking directly at the idea of humanity. You're looking at an example of humanity, and you might, at another remove, at an angle, you might then abstract out and learn about mankind by looking at Bob or Adam or Eve or anybody. But you're not looking directly at the idea, because that's impossible. Only your soul can look directly at the idea. And so Plato's attack, Socrates' attack on the artist, is that the artist is now looking at that emanation, that reflection of the idea, which is Achilles or Troy or whatever. And he's now giving you his sensory experience of that sort of derived or emanated thing that comes out. And now he's giving it to you at another remove because he's presenting you simply with a sensory experience, not even with the individual man, but just with an experience that you might have of the man. And he's kind of siphoned off. One ancient idea about how the senses worked is that all physical objects kind of give off these ghostly emanations, and those strike our senses. And so we don't like put things into our eyes to see them. We receive these sort of beams that emanate out of them, and now we would say we receive the light that reflects off of them and the sound waves that propagate from them. And so we are getting in our senses this kind of simulacrum, this image of a thing that is itself already an image. And so the problem with art, says Plato, is that you are getting an image of something, and it might be enough then to use that image to kind of reason about the thing, but you have therefore not really understood that the thing itself is already an image, that Adam is an image, that the man that you're looking at is an image. Achilles also is an image of something called man. And you can say this if you believe in the realm of the ideals. In fact, you have to say this in some sense, that whatever we experience through our senses, we experience symbolically. It's a kind of language. We're not getting the thing itself. We're getting the impact of light, let's say, on the rods and cones of our eyes, or we're getting vibrations in our ear canal that we, in our mind, unpack into the qualitative experience of sound. And the mystery is that we believe these motions and these physical encounters, which the ancients knew, just like we know, were physical events, material happenings. The magic, the mystery is that when we get that encounter, we are able to perform an act of translation and derive information that we believe to be true out of that encounter. And this is why the issue of art and the other issue that I'm talking about all this year, which is the issue of science and its relationship to spirituality, is they're in some sense they're one and the same issue, because the scientific revolution, or the divide between primary and secondary qualities, or whatever you want to call it, taught us to believe that the reality, the truth, quote unquote, of what's going on in these sensory experiences that we're having, that truth is the truth of the matter moving around, is the truth of, let's say, light waves propagating, or sound waves, or whatever biological interaction that's happening in the jelly of your eyes and all of that. And then everything else, the kind of qualitative experience, the color that you then see, or the timbre of the voice that you then hear, this is, quote unquote, merely human. It's only happening in the mind. And if we weren't here, if we imagine the world without us, the colors and sounds and all of that would vanish. Sensory experiences would vanish, but the motions, the physical relationships, the mathematics, the encounter of bodies with other bodies, that would endure. That would still be going on. And one of the things that we have started to learn in our most advanced physics is that actually this idea of a world made out of little tiny objects that are bouncing off of each other, that go on doing that when we're not looking, and have their kind of true, pure reality as just chunks of stuff. That idea is totally made up. And actually, even things like motion and position in space, these are kinds of information that we as humans are getting out of objects which are in themselves ineffable, cannot be described purely or accurately. It's impossible to give a description of an individual particle in a way that would satisfy conditions of motion and position that we as human beings need in order to picture them in our minds or have some kind of sensory experience of them. And so everything in the world is a kind of spiritual entity that then makes contact with our senses, and through our senses we experience even chairs and tables and couches, let alone men and love and memory and justice, as these things that come to us through the sensory experience, but actually are spiritual, actually are pure spirit. And so Socrates, perhaps with a certain degree of irony, is saying, if you're already doing that just on the daily, if your task, even just as a human being doing philosophy, is to try to get through or past your sensory experiences to the thing that your sense as a language is communicating to you, then why would you want to impose yet another degree of separation between you and the ineffable sublime truth. And instead you get this reflection of somebody's experience of the thing, which is just a sensory simulacrum called art, which is just a poem or an image or whatever. And whether or not we think that this means that poets should be exiled from the ideal regime, we do get to now ask, well, okay, if that's not what art is, if art is not just a reproduction of certain material experiences that are themselves only distant emanations of spirit, what actually is art? What actually are we doing when we make poetry? And this is where I think trying to answer Socrates' objection to art can get us a step closer to understanding what we're doing in our lives, but also in creating art and in being works of art, living out works of art in the manner that Giorgio Vasari kind of suggests. Because, okay, so let's say that God is the sublime artist. Let's say that he has these ideas like sun and moon, and then he clothes them in matter, and they are now embodied in some beautiful way, that he's expressing himself, and they are parts of him, and so when he makes man, then he's finally performing this act of artistic creation where he's clothing the ineffable in flesh. Great. Now, we are having experiences of those things. God sees, who knows how God sees the sun? He sees it presumably in all of its different moments and from every possible vantage point, almost like in a kind of cubist painting where you see the thing from every possible angle. But we can't see it, and that's why cubism as an artistic movement fails, right? We can't see things from every possible angle the way God can. He has this unimaginable kind of encounter or relationship with these things when he sees them in Genesis and calls them good. We only see them from our human standpoint. We just have this one picture of the sun in the sky, and we can accumulate different experiences of the sun, but you're always going to have different kinds of angles to look at it, ways to view it, positions from which to see it. And this is part of the joy of scientific discovery, is not so much that like, oh, we found out that the earth is revolving around the sun, and so now we will never experience the sun as if it revolves around the earth, but rather we've said, okay, if you look at it from a certain angle, now we see that it makes more sense to talk about the earth moving around the sun. But then once you get on into relativity, it turns out there are other ways that make more sense to look at it that don't even particularly ask the question, which is revolving around which. And so these material entities, which seem like such simple objects to us, or we're taught to think of them as simple objects, actually are these like white-hot, throbbing cores of spiritual being that then give off all of these sensory experiences that we're able to have in relationship with them. But because we're human, those experiences are partial. There are always going to be more experiences that we could have of any object, of a grain of dust, let alone of the sun. There's going to be some new way that we're able to experience and understand that every day, because his creation is new every morning, and because evermore from his store, new worlds rise up to adore. But that means that our experience is not God's experience, and that is very painful. Because if it's not the same thing, if we're not experiencing the world in the same way that God experiences it, how is it possible for our experience to be anything other than less and worse than God's? And so now the distance between God's perfect union of of the spirit and flesh, of however he sees the world, and our imperfect experience of the world mediated through the senses, that distance suddenly opens up and it yawns like a chasm between us and where we long to be, which is this union of the physical with the non-physical. And I think that chasm, that sorrow, that separation is what's behind some of what Socrates is saying about artists, is that they're just giving you a human perception. And what's the worth or the meaning of that? And the only answer that I can think to give to that question is if human experience in every moment actually contains within it something essential to the divine experience. And that is actually the burden and the point of the Christian idea of mankind in the image of God. That when we see the sun from our position on earth, or when we see the sky or even one another, yes, we are seeing something different from what God is seeing, because God sees every possible angle. But what we are not seeing is something irrelevant or useless to God. In fact, in some ways, perhaps we are, by experiencing the world from the human standpoint, bringing into being something that God urgently desires, which is a fresh perspective on the world, a way of looking at the world that otherwise would not exist. And if that's what we're doing, and if that's what every human being in some fundamental way is, if every human soul and consciousness that comes into existence is some fresh way of seeing the world, then art becomes the delivery system from one human mind and heart and soul to another of that irreducibly unique human experience and perception of the world. I have no way of giving to you how the world is in my eyes, and you have no way of giving that to me directly. You can't inject it into me. You can't hook me up to an IV or place goggles on my eyes and make me see the world the way you see it. But what you can do is you can say to me, it's like this. It's as if I were throbbing with a kind of emotional energy, or it's as if my heart dropped into my shoes, or it's as if I saw a stag from afar and I was chasing after that stag and trying to hunt the stag. And as we begin to talk to one another in these ways, it seems bizarre that we should be using metaphor and symbolic language and all that, and yet we do it all the time, even in everyday speech. And the reason we do it is because we are communicating to one another our distinctive view on the world, what it's like to be us, which is similar but totally different from what it's like to be somebody else. Any human being is going to see the world in a way that is not quite the same as the way everybody else sees it. And this is why, as C.S. Lewis reminds us, the angels in Isaiah's vision, in Isaiah chapter 6, cry out, "Holy, holy, holy," to one another, because God hasn't just created the world in its pure abstract sense, the way he sees it. He hasn't even just created the world the way you see it. He's also created the world the way your friend sees it, and the way your friend communicates it back to you. And so even though there's only one universe, there's actually an unlimited number of ways that this creation can be further generating new life, new existence, new reality. And so when we make art, one might answer Plato, what we actually do is we convey to one another this sense of the world as we see it. And we do that even in our most basic acts of communication, which are kind of the rudiment of art. If I use language, I'm already making you hear or see or touch or experience something that gets at what it's like to be me and what it's like to see the world as me. And if I make a work of art, then I'm doing that for a huge range of people. What I'm creating is a kind of box or a vial or a container in which there is my experience of the world, or some part of the world as seen through my eyes or the eyes of another that I've imagined into being. And now, suddenly, if that's true, then it's possible to open up a dimension for things to be different from the way God sees them, but not necessarily worse in the sense of being bad. Because if we deviate morally from God, we know that's worse than not deviating morally from God. But if that's true, how can we exist at all? Because in order to exist, we have to be not God. We have to be something other than God. So for God to create free human consciousnesses, free human souls, he has to create something that can differ from him in some way. But if we differ from him morally, then we've, in some sense, condemned ourselves. But if we differ from him aesthetically, that is, in the way that we see the world, then in some sense we've actually added to the store of creation. And I wanted to read to you now, just in closing, a passage from Paradise Lost that will get across to you, I think, why it is that this is so essential to our existence. And if you haven't caught on to this, what I'm trying to deliver to you here is a baseline theory of art that is going to allow us to reason about how we make art, how we communicate to one another, how we live in the world, that will actually affect how we relate to each other, how we vote, what we do, and how we act in this physical embodied world, which is to say, in order to do any of that, in order to reason about any of that, we have to understand that our material existence, our breaths that we take on this earth and the days that we live of our lives are a language. They are a way of communicating ineffable realities that would not exist if you personally did not exist, and I personally did not exist. That God, as part of his creation, has chosen to create the beings that we are. And our actions, our words, our deeds are all supposed to reflect that truth. And they often do not, which is why we fall so short and why all the Claudine Gay stuff is real that I was talking about last week. And yet it is possible for us to aspire to it. I'm going to read to you now a passage from John Milton's Paradise Lost, which is a poem I've been spending a lot of time with lately. At rejoiceevermore.substack.com, I'm building a serial audiobook. So for paid subscribers, if you want to sign up there, you'll hear me read this whole poem throughout the year from start to finish. But there is a passage that I recently read in book 3 that is about this necessity for us to be something other than God. That is, God has created in us something that is not the same thing as him, and that's the whole point. And without that possibility of deviation and wrongness, it's impossible for us truly to be right, that is, truly to love and do good. So here's book 3, Paradise Lost. I use the Routledge edition, which has a lot of beautiful notes in it and is very sort of well sourced and documented. This one you don't have to worry about the translation because it was written in English, but it's a great, this is a great edition. So here's God, the Father, talking about his creation of mankind and why he created mankind with the potential to sin, even though he didn't make them sin. So he begins actually by talking about Satan and the rebel angels who have already fallen. But he says, I made him just and right, sufficient to have stood, though free to fall. Such I created all the ethereal powers and spirits, both them who stood and them who failed. Freely they stood who stood, and fell who fell. Not free, what proof could they have given sincere of true allegiance, constant faith, or love? Where only what they needs must do appeared, not what they would, what praise could they receive? What pleasure I from such obedience paid, when will and reason also is choice, useless and vain, of freedom both despoiled, made passive both, had served necessity, not me. He's saying if I had made robots that just praised me automatically and did what was right automatically, what would be the point? It would be like making playthings or toys, and God doesn't need toys. He doesn't need us either, but he chose to create beings that could love him because that seemed good and seemed good indeed for the beings. But in order to do that, he had to make them in some way able to go astray. And so the very fact that it's possible for us to deviate from the right path, not to speak the truth, is a consequence of the fact that we were made able, with distance between us and God, as different entities than him, who don't just automatically do everything he wants or say everything he tells us to say, able then to choose and to express freely what is right and true and good. And so that is what we do when we pursue virtuous action. We're not actually trying to avoid the nasty bad, getting scolded by our teacher or whatever. We're actually trying to make our lives into a work of art. And when we make art, we're trying to express some reality that is true and accurate and honest. And this is why I've been harping on honesty, because I know that authenticity is kind of an overused idea these days. And it's something that we kind of throw around like, oh yeah, I just want to be my authentic self. But that's actually exactly the opposite of what I'm talking about here. When people say they want to be their authentic selves, they mean, I'm just finding a jumbled mess of desires and ideas and contradictory thoughts inside of me, and I'm generating that automatically, and that's coming out of me, and so that's what I'm doing and saying. And so what is outward, my actions, my outward life, is going to correspond exactly to my inward life as I find it. But the life of virtue actually says instead, outside of me, in the mind of God, there is held a being that is me, that I perceive dimly and yearn toward. And so real authenticity, real honesty is going to be living life in the here and now. My outward life is going to reflect the inward truth that I discern in God. In other words, I'm working from God's model, not from mine. I'm working from a model that is part of the spiritual world, and I'm trying to draw the physical world up into that. And the aid that I have for doing that is language, communication, and art. I always feel a little bit goofy when I say something like, this is the point of the doctrine of the incarnation, but this is the point of the incarnation. This is why the Christian idea is that God took on human flesh, because human flesh was always an appropriate vehicle for God, and the sum total of all human experiences would still not be enough to exhaust the store of ways of experiencing the world and seeing things that are latent in and present within God, and we are the realization of that potential. Start from there. Start from yourself as a spiritual being with a unique contribution to make to the sum total of experiences of the world. And stop asking whether you are on the right team or doing the thing that your friends are going to like. And then you will actually have a way forward in this tumultuous presidential election year that we are likely to have. The whole reason that everybody is always telling you you're a traitor to the cause or to the republic, or you must urgently support this cause or else Donald Trump will be disappointed. The reason they're talking to you that way, or Joe Biden will be miserably angry with you if you don't vote Democrat, or if you don't vote for me, you ain't black, which is a thing that Biden really said, right? The reason that they talk to you that way is because they sense how desperately you want to be the thing that you were made to be. And since we do not have these inner resources for determining who we are being offered these labels: patriot, black, gay, Democrat, Republican, that we have to then live up to. And that enables people to bully us, because then they can offer us those labels or take them away depending on whether or not we give them power. Instead of all of that, scrap all of that. Know who you are already as having been created in the image of God, and generating from that aspiration to virtue, to excellence, to goodness, to truth, actions out of which you cannot be shaken by some name-calling idiot online who wants to intimidate you into being thought of as, I don't know, some sort of failure or traitor or whatever word they're racist, domestic terrorist, whatever word they're going to throw at you. The reason that we're doing that to each other in our politics is because we have not yet grasped the true nature of what we are, which is works of art in the image of God. How's that for election commentary? Be here all night, folks. I'm going to take a mailbag question now from Caden. Caden has written to me, as all mailbag writers do, via rejoiceevermore.substack.com. That's my Substack. It's where you will get my weekly newsletter for free and a bunch of other goodies if you would like to pay to support me. You should also, by the way, sign up for thenewjerusalem.substack.com, which is my joint Substack with Andrew Clavin, my father, no relation. And we are going to be talking a lot about these issues of faith in the 21st century and how to deal most truly with the things that matter most. So please do sign up for both of those Substacks. I would love to have you on either of these lists. If you're on the Rejoice Evermore list, you can write in with a mailbag question, and that's what Caden has done. He says, "Hey Spencer, thank you so much for this podcast. I've been listening for some years now and have found lots of encouragements from the lessons you share here. I'm really always so delighted to hear that. That's wonderful. I've made more efforts to study the Western canon for myself, having read many of C.S. Lewis's books and planning to read the Odyssey." Oh, good. I hope you enjoy it. Let me know what you think of it. "One of my favorite series was your episodes on the brothers Karamazov, and after making it halfway through this novel, I can say that this is one of the books that has changed my life. Even so, every time I add that acclaim to a book, I feel a sense of guilt for not feeling as passionate about the Bible. I love and admire the accounts of Christ and his teachings, and it shaped who I am today. I've had life-changing experiences with the scriptures, but I'm not sure why it isn't one of the first on my list of life-changing books. You seem to have a good sense of the Bible and can infuse it well with other great works. What are your thoughts on this? Is the Bible the centerpiece of your canon? How do you utilize the great writings of man without making idols of them? Thanks for all you do, and I hope to hear from you soon." Okay, I love this question, and I think a lot of people might feel this way, that if they are spending time on a different book than the Bible, they are not being quote unquote good enough Christians. Like they haven't met their quota of time spent with the Bible, or even if they like reading a particular book more than they like reading the Bible at any given moment, that means that they have failed or their faith isn't true or pure enough. And here's what I would say about this. The Bible is unique. It's a kind of book that no other kind of book is. There is no other book like the Bible. And it stands as the cornerstone of the faith. Without it, we have no touchstone to refer back to as we go forward in the world and in life. And so I think any Christian needs to think that about the Bible, needs to relate to the Bible that way. And what that means for me certainly is that there is a moment in time set aside every day for reading the Bible, wherever I am in any particular reading. It's right after I wake up. I think that's a particularly good time to do it. But if we follow this out, this reasoning that you're suggesting out to its logical conclusion, then really I should just only always be reading the Bible, because the Bible has all the truth and the Bible has everything you need. And if I like other books, then I must be straying. But we know that's not true. We know that great Christians throughout the world, great believers, have loved and even written books besides the Bible, and must have believed that there was some purpose in doing that, or else they would have just retired and taken a vow of silence. And so we have to ask, well, what's the point of any other book besides the Bible? And I think the answer is actually contained in what we were talking about on this episode, that the Bible as a cornerstone, or the cornerstone of all truth, or the cornerstone book of all knowledge and wisdom, is not therefore the last word on everything. It does not exhaust the fullness of what there is to say. In fact, because God makes the world as this source of all joy and existence and life, but then makes person after person after person to experience the world in some new and different way, there's actually no end to what those people can draw out of the world. And this, I think, is how God works. He creates something, but then the thing he creates is endlessly new and regenerative for each individual. And so the Bible, even when you read a great work of the Western canon, it's true, you're not technically reading the Bible, but in some sense you are reading an offshoot of the Bible. Everything in the West comes in some sense, even if it's in negative reaction, comes out of this cornerstone reality, which, if we believe in the incarnation and in the creation through the Son, everything in the world is already inscribed with the nature of God. And so when somebody draws some new truth out of that and places it into a book that speaks particularly to you, there's every possibility that that's actually the working of the Holy Spirit, that that's actually God's action in you, uniquely drawing out of whatever text you're dealing with, something that is core and urgent to his project of creating the world in creating you. Because if he didn't want new stuff to exist in the world, he wouldn't have made you to begin with. You are here around so that a new vision of the world can come into existence. And so I would say, if you are reading the Bible regularly and you are thinking about it and making reference to it, you don't have to worry about your feelings, how you feel about any given book in any given moment. That's actually up to God to deliver those emotional connections. Sometimes I go through periods where I love reading the Bible and can't wait to do it. I go through periods where it's kind of a chore, and I'm reading the Begats, and I know it's good for me and I know it matters, but I'm still doing it, right? We have this obsession with what we happen to be feeling in the moment that makes us feel as if we're not doing things right if we don't feel a certain way. And actually, a much, I think, more sustainable way of dealing with this is to say it's a discipline. I have a discipline. I have committed myself to a lifelong connection with this book centrally in a role that no other book plays, and it is going to therefore occupy a space every day that no other book occupies. But the reason that I'm doing that is because this cornerstone is endlessly generative of new truths, new insights, new civilizations, new cultural joy, all of that. And the fruits of that truth are also good to enjoy in life and to delight in. And sometimes one corner of that house is going to be particularly pleasing to you, and you should luxuriate in it and delight and give thanks to God that his truth has generated this new corner of the world for you to occupy, be it Brothers Karamazov, which I share with you, a real attachment to that novel, as you know, or something else that I've never heard of. You are not betraying God by enjoying the good things that he has enabled to exist by creating humanity. You are only betraying God if you have somehow, in some way, attacked or destroyed or are trying to hem in the infinite goodness of his mercy and his creation. I would set your mind at ease about this. It's something that I understand the impulse to worry about, but if you examine the impulse, I think you will realize that you don't actually believe what the worry is suggesting to you. The worry is suggesting to you really that you should always only be reading the Bible, and you don't believe that. You know that's not right. That's not how any Christian ever has operated. And even those who sort of suggest that that's how one ought to operate don't operate that way. Because the Bible, despite being central and core, is not the only book in the world and isn't intended to be the only book in the world or to render all other books obsolete. Hope that helps and resolves the anxiety a little bit. Thanks, as always, for the question. And thank you all for listening. It's really such a joy to do this podcast. I love hearing from you. One more time, if you want to be in the mailbag, go to rejoiceevermore.substack.com. If you want to support this show, that would really make my day, and you can do that in a number of ways. You can subscribe so you never miss an episode. You can give 5 stars, whatever platform you're currently listening to, write a review, share it on social media. All of this is great. Sign up for our YouTube channel if that's something you're into. It's also just Young Heretics on YouTube or Spotify and Apple podcasts and everywhere you get podcasts. Please do help me to build and grow this audience. That's it for me. I will see you next time for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.